I like to know the right way of doing something. Like it bugs me if I'm just like,
Right,
okay,
right.
sure, I might do some kind of scrappy thing.
Hey there, welcome to Book Overflow. This is the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here by my co-host Nathan Toups. How are you doing, Nathan?
Doing great. Hey, everybody.
Well, thanks for listening, everyone. As always, wherever you're at, like, comment, subscribe if you're on YouTube. If you're on an audio platform, take a break right now. Give us a 5-star review. It really helps the podcast. You can share it on LinkedIn with your friends and coworkers. And you can also book time with us on Leland if you're interested in one-on-one coaching experience with either Nathan or I. And we are excited about this week. We're excited about the podcast in general. We don't count our chickens before they hatch here, but we have made contact with a few authors of the previous books we've read, and we have some things on the calendar, but we've had things fall through in the past before, so we won't tell you who it is, but we're hoping, we're optimistic here. We've got some author interviews coming through the pipeline, so please stay tuned for those. And we're excited about this week. We went dark last week. Before this, we did Mastering Open Telemetry, right, Nathan?
Exactly. Yeah. So we're getting into some deep dives.
Yes. So we're focusing a little more on some domain-specific books. We're seeing how that goes. We'll talk a bit about how we feel that's going over the course of the episode, because we've got this week, we have Advanced React by Nadia Makarevich. I'm sure I pronounced that wrong. My deepest apologies, Nadia. But let's give you the author introduction and the book introduction. We have here, Nadia is a front-end architect, coder, writer, and educator. At Atlassian, she worked across multiple Jira teams before joining the front-end platform team, where she was responsible for the architecture, builds, deploys, and best practices of the entire Jira front-end repository. 3 years ago, she left big tech to join a small startup as a founding engineer. She writes about advanced React concepts and speaks at conferences worldwide. When it comes to React, she's seen it all. Then for the book introduction, we have, this book takes your React knowledge beyond the basics. It's for developers who've built simple apps and want to understand how React actually works under the hood: performance, re-renders, reconciliation, closures, composition, patterns, memoization, and more. Each chapter is a focused investigation that builds on previous concepts. Every chapter includes learning objectives up front and key takeaways at the end, so you can read cover to cover or skip to what matters most. Not for complete beginners. You should be comfortable building at least a simple to-do app before diving in. And I would add, at least, I think you should be comfortable building more than a simple to-do app before diving in, because this truly is advanced React. And maybe we can talk a bit about that. Nathan, we read the first half of the book. We're through chapter 8. Give me your thoughts on Advanced React by Nadia Makarevich.
Yeah. So I knew React had gotchas, like plenty of gotchas, but wow. Like I did not realize we this book kind of led us through how deep the gotchas can get, where you're like, oh, cool, I'm going to use Memo, or I'll do some state management that I read in a tutorial. And then how many foot guns are involved if you don't understand the abstractions properly. And I thought this book did a good job of being like, hey, you want to solve this problem? Now you're really tangled up, and this state management is not doing what you think it is. And here's how you actually get out of this hole. I thought the structure of this book was so cool. And yeah, I think we're going to try to figure out how to talk about domain-specific books like this. I think Carter and I probably are going to riff a little bit, because you really have to live in the book to make this work. But I think maybe, I think this book makes you think a lot, which I thought was cool. I appreciated that. I was kind of expecting to do a slog and look at some philosophical things and kind of move on. But I was actually like, oh, this is really well written. This is really cool. So,
Yeah, I will say, I think this is one of the best written books we've read here on the podcast. This reminds me a lot of Refactoring by Martin Fowler.
Oh, yeah, good point.
Which I think is, I'd say, the gold standard for kind of like a deeply technical book. You can tell the author, she is very, very talented. I did not have the chance to read her background until just now when we did the author introduction, and it doesn't surprise me one bit that she was on the front end platform team and Jira. As much as we all kind of poke fun at Jira, I mean, there's no doubt that it is an app where front end performance is absolutely critical and a huge product in our industry. So very, very impressive background from her. And the book just does a really great job of it kind of sets up a mystery with each chapter. Kind of like, here, you might try to do this, but then you would see that this happens. Now, why does that happen? And then she just does an excellent job of kind of explaining everything from the very basic foundation, getting into the details, but not being too overwhelming. We talked about when we read Mastering Open Telemetry, how the author very clearly understood open telemetry very well. He was one of the inventors of it, but there was a little bit of like structure problems with the book, and it was unclear kind of maybe who he was writing to in any given chapter. You don't have that problem at all with this book. This book is very, very clearly written towards like, hey, you're an intermediate React developer, you want to be an advanced React developer, here you go. And she's very, very talented. Another book that I think suffers with the Book Overflow format. I think we just by nature kind of have to power through these books. There are times reading this book where I'm like, I'm sad I just have to get through the reading for today, because I really would like to spend more time with this section and kind of deeply understand it. So, I think that's not a pro or a con for the book. It's just a reality with how we do this podcast. But it doesn't affect the fact that, her React knowledge is deep. And I think, maybe we'll talk about this a bit more. Domain specific books for us. We're just trying to figure out exactly like, okay, how does that work? Because we don't really want to spend an hour here summarizing code snippets or trying to like speak code snippets to you guys. So not exactly sure how these kind of like, it's just a lot easier for us to talk about like the Software Engineer's Guidebook or Radical Candor or Made to Stick, or even something like the Fundamentals of Software Architecture. So I don't know. We'll see how it goes. But not a slight against the author or this book at all. Very, very talented. One of the better crafted books we've had.
Yeah, it's me and not you, right? It's our format. Because again, I was thinking about this exact same thing, which is, imagine there was a book called Advanced Open Telemetry, and it was in this format.
Yes.
And it basically went with the assumption that, hey, because I think what I like about this book is it's always said, it kind of implies, it never talks down to the reader, which I really appreciate, but it's kind of like, hey, you're probably tangled up in this, right? Like, you built something, it got sufficiently complex, and we've all been there, right? We kind of come in bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. We know that we need to use some technology. We're pretty good generally, but we don't know all the idiomatic caveats of some tool. And what happens is you get tangled up, right? You think you have a good mental model of how something works. It might be even pretty well reasoned with the assumptions that you have. And then you're wrong. It doesn't work, right? Or, and I think with the big thing with React, and I think why it's so cool that she starts this way, she starts with re-rendering, which is something that everyone who deals with React gets surprised by, right? You're like, when does this component re-render? When am I actually, when do I use effect, and when do I have to pass something into that array to like watch a variable? And, what do props do here? And how do I handle children and parents and the relationship? And all of these things that you will read if you read the React intro or some of the good documentation, you can read enough and you go, okay, cool, I get this. Like, yeah, child components and things flow down, and, some basic things. And then she starts showing you how you're wrong.
Yeah, she's and I think this book is a great advertisement for the idea. I don't know, I think there's a misconception among software engineers sometimes that are almost like, it's like you have like a skill bucket, and it's like for every, like you only can allocate so many skills out of your bucket, like like you're building a character in an RPG, and you're kind of like, okay, for every point I give to communication abilities or well-spokenness, that's a point I'm taking away from like raw technical talent. This book will just completely disabuse you of that notion, because Nadia is such a great communicator and a very, very talented author. And also, man, her React knowledge is so deep. Yeah, really impressive, and just a great advertisement for like, you should be trying to improve your communication abilities as much as you're improving your technical abilities.
Yeah. I'm going to butcher the title, but she also has another book about, I think it's performance and benchmarking in front-end development. And I will tell you, the big takeaway that I learned from this was how data-driven she is, right? It's, it's not, there's no gut check here. It's literally, and the cool part is in every section of this book, there's runnable code examples. I only touched a couple of those because I knew I just needed to get through, but I will definitely be using this as a reference. I will definitely be looking at these code examples because they teach you those common pitfalls. And you have to be able to benchmark, and you have to be able to do performance tuning to get, React to behave properly and to understand how it actually works under the hood.
Well, maybe we could talk just a bit then about our experience with React.
Yeah.
I guess Nathan, I was thinking about this while I was reading this. I'm like, I don't know exactly what Nathan's done with React or how proficient he considers himself with it.
So I was CTO in an early stage startup, and we started building our tool in Angular back in the day.
Angular, okay.
Oh yeah, and so React was the new kid on the block, and you have to remember we got funding in 2015.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think Series A happened in maybe 2016. I'm not 100% sure. But we decided to we were getting really tangled up in Angular. We had a couple of really, really smart software engineers that we had hired who were really big on React. And this is before webhooks. So this is actually before everything got function based. It was like still class based. So this is like old school, old grandpa React version of if you can call it that. But we were using one of the earliest versions of React. The refactor was amazing. And I will tell you, I was CTO, so I was not deep in the code day to day, though I did have to understand architecturally what we were doing. We had a very clear, single page app build with an API server on the back end. So we had these clear separations. There was nothing like Next.js. There was nothing, and we weren't doing server-side rendering or any of this other stuff that's come up. So I do have my initial interaction, and I also appreciate, because she actually talks about in the middle of the chapters we read this round of how to get legacy code that does a bunch of these higher order components updated into these more modern webhook stuff. And then I've also used React for personal projects here and there, just messing around with them. But I've not been responsible for a production React application. Right? It's really kind of I'll kick the tires with Svelte, I'll kick the tires with React, or HTMX, or Vue.js. I've played a lot with these things just to kind of wrap my head around it. But I keep coming back to React, and I think one of the reasons I was happy to do this book is that React isn't going anywhere, right? Especially React and JSX, this pattern of how we build state management and syntactic sugar on top of stuff. And so I am by no means a React expert, but I know enough to be dangerous. I would say that I'm probably beginner to intermediate level. I can have an intelligent conversation with a React developer, but I'm by no means a front-end dev, right? So front-end dev would just run circles around me and laugh at the decisions I make sometimes.
Right. No, I'm the same way in that you give me a Figma and you say, hey, we have to build this component, right? I can go out and add to a front end, and but even then, a lot of times I'm kind of just looking at is there anywhere else in the application we're doing something similar? Okay, we're doing this, let's do it here. I'm going to tell you one bit about whether what I'm doing is best practice, or as Martin Fowler says, a sensible default or not. I got my start in Angular 2 when I was at the entertainment Fortune 500 company. We were using Angular. I remember when I left, I spent a bit of time at that awful little startup, and it was I remember being surprised when we were using React and someone was trying to say oh yeah, React is better. And I was I don't know, I mostly know Angular, and so let me check it out. And I was shocked at just how immediately I was wow, React is better. Angular is very opinionated about how you structure everything. And then I was shocked with React. I remember seeing the classic, you have an array and then you do the map function, and then you're converting it into components. And I was just oh wow, we're just writing JavaScript essentially, and it's JSX, right? And then that's being turned into UI, which I thought was really, really interesting. But even today, I would say I'm about as much a React developer as anyone else. I do a lot of front end work at my current company. And I guess this kind of relates, but it's maybe a little off topic. Everyone talks about kind of that T-shaped skill pattern, right? That you should kind of be very broad in one thing and then, or very broad in a lot of things and then very deep in one thing. I've been thinking about that with my own career, because I think one thing I really admire about, or one thing I really strive to do, and I've decided sort of important to me as a software engineer, is I kind of want to be able to do it all. Like, I was talking with an engineer the other day who, we were just talking about some code, and he works on kind of like one specific function at his company. I said, like, oh, where are you running your code? He says, oh, well, that's the infra team's job. And I'm a little like, you're the infra team, right? And so we read the DevOps handbook, big believer in this idea of DevOps. And so to me, it's really important to understand, like, how does my code get from my machine to the internet, and how are we monitoring it? How are we, measuring performance, all of that. And I would like to standardize on like a tech stack. I think I've bounced around from company to company, and each one has had their kind of own different tech stack. And I'd love to kind of be focused on like Java, React, React TypeScript, React, or Node TypeScript, and like AWS. Like, if I could choose a tech stack, like, that's kind of, I think, what I'd like to kind of be focused on. But I feel like I just keep going broader instead of deeper. Like, I've been really, really interested in Terraform lately, and actually just got our company. I'd done some work with Terraform. I talked about that on the podcast, but just got our company set up with like a HashiCorp's actual managed Terraform platform product, and have been able to introduce like some actual real deal Terraform workflows to the company. But that's kind of an example of like, okay, I have Java at my fingertips, I have React at my fingertips, but I find myself, instead of going deeper with these, I want to learn more about, like, well, tell me about OpenTelemetry, tell me about Terraform. I get the impression you're maybe a little the same, Nathan, but I don't know. What are your thoughts about this kind of T-shaped pattern?
No, for sure. So my area, my deep expertise has been in, SRE and platform engineering,
right?
But because of the types
of broad field,
it is. And right. So I've specifically in observability, right? Like that area, and CI/CD pipelines. I guess maybe CI/CD pipelines are the biggest thing that I've been focused on. But I've been going broad partially because of Georgia Tech, partially because at the bigger startups, and I'm talking like Series C startup, right? So still small, but big enough that you can have specialized teams that go off and do greenfield projects. We kind of have to be scrappy enough to build our own stuff. I think this is doubly true now that we have large language models on our side. You're kind of expected to not do an ADR or some presentation of what you would like to build. You just build a thing and show them how it would be valuable. And so you need to know enough JavaScript to be dangerous, right? You need to know enough about a full stack engineering piece. So even if your end goal, let's say for platform engineering, it might be an internal developer platform, right? Internal developer platform might have something like a service registry, some tools that it ties into, measuring the scorecard or health of something, right? Like whatever, we're going to get into that. You might be able to get something directly off the shelf, but a lot of times you have to like do some custom code, or maybe you understand some core tooling that you need to do. And somebody who has that deep expertise, but also knows enough about, I can get a basic CRUD application up that's got user experience that's, good enough for somebody on our product team to use Google Auth and then fill out a form and it kicks off a custom Terraform thing. If you could do that kind of thing, you're golden, right? Like you're in a really good position. And that's where that, like, sure, maybe I'll spend a minute learning a little bit more about how Next.js does server-side rendering, or if I'm been enabled to use something like Vercel because maybe our infrastructure team's too busy. And so with Vercel, I like to use Go. So like with Vercel, I can actually use these little edge functions in Go and then have it talk to my Next.js app and do all these other things. That level of complexity where it's like, I'm learning a lot about, I'm learning a little about a lot of things to get something up in Scrappy. I'm a fan of that. I mean, it makes things fun and exciting. You do risk, though, getting spread too thin. Right. Especially if like you start stepping on toes, or you might do something dangerous and you don't realize it, right? You misunderstand a security model of something, or or you go down a wild goose chase and you're doing something that's not valuable to the company, right? Like you're doing resume-based development or whatever, where sure, it sounds cool, it might be a good blog post, but like, does it move the needle at the company?
Yeah, I think that's why I find myself kind of drawn to things that are a little more cross-functional and things that are a little more evergreen. Like you're talking about CI/CD pipelines, telemetry. It's like no matter what company you go at, you can implement those things in a way that's like best practice, so to speak. And then like again, I really would like to become like the master of TypeScript or the master of Java, but it's a little like you go to your next company and hey, it might be Go. React, I think, is one where you can feel a little more comfortable being like, I want to dedicate a lot of time to getting better at React because I don't really know a ton of, especially startups or fast growing companies or kind of tech companies that are not on React.
Right.
So I think React is one of the better options here.
It also used to be, I think it's less so now, but it used to be that front end developers were kind of like put in a little box and they're like considered separate. And then we went overboard with like the full stack developer, which is literally kind of a jack of all trades. I've seen full stack developers be very different company to company of like what the expectations are. But now with frameworks like Next.js and some of these other kind of very interesting tools, where we're doing a lot of, you're still thinking components, but there's a server-side rendering piece. There's a client-side rendering piece. You have to understand state management. Actually, state machines, I'll put it this way, every excellent front-end full-stack React developer that I know, they're like state machine maximalists. They think about the way that state machines function, how state management works. And that's, again, a big topic in this book, is you're dealing with complex state management across where you're trying to reduce the side effects. When I make a change here, can I minimize the number of redraws or the number of re-renders that are happening up the path to get back to some other piece that I need? Can I minimize that? A lot of times in infrastructure, we'll call it blast radius. Like, how much of an impact does a change here impact these other pieces? I really appreciate that. Like, as I've done a ton of backend infrastructure work and API development, I have a big respect for actually how hard the job is to be good at React and be good at front end stuff. And so I have a deep respect for this. And honestly, when I read books like Nadia's book, I'm like, wow, like this is like a masterclass in like user empathy, performance obsession, and they're in the front lines. This is the code that's running in your browser, right? This is the stuff that's sitting in hostile environments where you can't trust lots of things. And that's a really cool type of programming that you have to do.
Yeah, React and front-end development is interesting because I think, like, I don't know, as back-end engineers, like, we take a lot of pride in like kind of the distributed system nature of development, like to understand how all the different components act together. I mean, that's, when you make like an architecture diagram, kind of throw it up and be like, look at all these different pieces and look at how they're all talking to each other. Isn't that neat? And so I think, there's some back-end engineers who will like look down on a front-end engineer because, like, it is just one code base. The entire logic for it lives in that code base. But I mean, I'm with you, Nathan. Like, the more you read about it and the more you understand it, the more you realize just how much there is going underneath the hood. But I think maybe the difference here is, and you can make this argument for backend, right? Is kind of like, how many of us have really worked on like a React app that is performance critical, right? And for what it's worth, I think you can make that same thing with the backend. Like, people are setting up Kubernetes clusters for, something that gets 7 requests a second, right? Or they've got really complicated microservices architecture for something that could probably be run as a monolith on a couple Raspberry Pis. And so, I think maybe it's just easier to overcomplicate backend in a way that it isn't to overcomplicate front end. But, I think we're going to talk a bit here and like what kind of stood out to us in these couple chapters. But a lot of it is just kind of talking about these little performance quirks. But the more I kept coming back to this, the more I kept thinking like, but do I really need to know this? Like, I've just never been in charge of a React app that's really performance critical. Right. And who really is exactly?
So
I know that people are.
One of the reasons I like this book and why I guess I'm kind of a nut for things like this is that at some point someone's going to run into a critical path that it blows up in their face. And if we throw up a flame graph and we're looking at stuff, I as somebody who does a lot of observability stuff, increasingly, and we talked about this in open telemetry, RUM data, right? The real user monitoring, the user monitoring that's in the browser, that's getting shoved up into our open telemetry stack more and more. Yeah, and I think it's really important that we're like, hey, people are complaining about how slow the backend is, but actually, I think this might be, unnecessary component redraws that are doing fetch calls back to the server and they don't need to be there, right? Like, and the fact that I can talk about these, like, I have a mental model of how React functions, and I go, we're fetching the same exact data over and over every time we're doing a mouse click. Why are we doing that? Right. And then, so this is the point where it helps me understand, like, hey, I think maybe you've misapplied use callback or use memo or memoization, or, you don't understand quite how the child component should function. And so, you make some state change and it, perfect example, right? Is that if you, I thought that the idea of props, of using props, where, a lot of times in React, we have a parent component, and then you pass state down into the client component, or the child components, and maybe that there's a piece of some data that you want to pass down. And if you're re-rendering, let's say, a function, right, that re-rendering that function is actually a pointer to, it's a reference under the hood. Well, that reference is going to get a new identifier every time you create this new function, even if you have some sort of state encapsulation inside of it. And so you may actually be forcing re-renders of child components and you don't even realize it, even if the data inside of that component doesn't change, right? And these are the kind of like gotchas where you're like, okay, well, maybe when my data is small or this or that, redrawing or re-rendering, that's no big deal. But let's say you do get a bunch of data that you're querying across, or these other things, the state management gets nuts. And I think it's just like, it's like keeping your room clean. You're not going to get arrested and go to jail if your room's not tidy, right? But if you're in a bind and you need to find your keys and your house is a total wreck, it's going to be way harder to find your keys, right? And I think that's the same thing with debugging. If you have a really messy code base and you need to debug, you're going to have a lot of problems. But if I have an efficient code base that's well structured and well organized and well understood, and I need to debug, wow, so much easier, right? And this book demonstrates a command of understanding why I'm using React. Like, why am I going through this great ritual of state management obsession just to not re-render some piece of state,
Right. And for me, what I've been thinking a lot of my career right now is premature optimization. And because you can look at anything in a startup and say, this is bad, we shouldn't be doing this, we could improve this way, but like, does it move the needle? Does it actually help the business? We had that with Terraform, where so a couple, like 2 months ago or so, we started up kind of a newish project. It was going to require creating some resources in the cloud. And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to do this in Terraform, just kind of get it figured out. And so I just got it set up in Terraform, just kind of like on my own, executing it from the CLI. And it was good. It was good to learn about Terraform for me, because I'd never really done a ton of work with it. But then after it was done, it was a little like, yeah, but only Carter knows how to run the Terraform. And so at the beginning, I was kind of like, hey, we should get like a kind of Terraform platform, like a managed Terraform platform provider. But people were like, we don't even know. We don't even know if we want this. But then after doing that project, I was like, so I think we definitely know we want Terraform as a company. We're all agreed on that. And if I spend, half an hour a month helping people set up their environment variables locally so that they can run this Terraform locally, like, then the cost, we've already lost in productivity what it would take, or what we'd be paying to like a managed Terraform provider, just because at this point we don't have enough Terraform resources for it to be cost prohibitive. And I'm like, and the fact that we don't have a Terraform provider is causing us to not adopt Terraform, because we just think it's a big hassle and headache to run it. So for a new project, I got signed up from the CTO, got us set up with the Terraform provider, and it's been really, really good. But again, like, we've been trying not to prematurely optimize, and then only after kind of experimenting with a bit did we realize, like, I actually think by not optimizing, we are preventing ourselves from adopting good patterns. And kind of with this, right, it's like, when do you want to in a React app to say, okay, let's really make it performance critical now? And it's a little like, and so I guess the answer to that would be like, well, you do benchmarking and you figure out what's taking a long time, right? But then it's also like, yeah, but even that's a big investment at like a startup to be like, oh, let me set up like, benchmarking across the entire React app and let's monitor it and have reviews about it. You're kind of, to me, just doing like just like an eyeball test at the beginning. And I do like, she in chapter 5, I highlighted this because I thought it was really insightful. She's talking about like, okay, well, when is performance a problem? When does an app feel slow? She says, executing a regular expression on a text that takes 100 milliseconds feels slow, but if it's run as a result of a button click once in a blue moon, buried somewhere deep in the settings screen, then it's almost instant. A regular expression that takes 30 milliseconds to run seems fast enough, but if it runs on the main page on every mouse move or scroll event, it's unforgivably slow and needs to be improved. Which I thought was kind of a great way to say, like, it's not some threshold. Like, if anything takes more than 50 milliseconds, that's bad, right? Kind of depends on how frequently it's being used.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I'm just thinking about our app at work today and thinking, like, would it really be worth our time to like do a bunch of benchmarking and look at all these patterns in the book and find out where we're misapplying them and kind of tidy it up? And like, I don't think we could justify that at this stage where we're a Series A company.
So I'll push back.
Okay.
Which is, this gets back to the tidy first argument that Kent Beck makes. And this is that, so one of the things that we did at our startup is that we had what are called refactor Fridays. So after a 2-week sprint, our 2-week sprints were actually 9 days. So we had a buffer just in case we had to like clean up some stuff. So we'd only slip by a day, but we had to ship within that interval. But if we shipped everything we wanted, we would have this sort of like, after demo on Friday, we would the rest of the day we could like work on something that could be wrapped up that day. That was kind of like a reward. And so this was kind of like an inherent sort of like innovation lab where maybe somebody was really bothered by our test setup and wanted to just kind of like spend half a day or a full day getting testing, bootstrapped and CI CD configured properly. This also turned into like, I think that maybe there's a performance bug. Like, I don't think you have to have end-to-end continuous benchmarking, but making it so that I can say, run this test in benchmark mode and give me the results is really useful. Go has this out of the box. Like I can actually run in my test suite. I can run some benchmark stuff and it gives me a bunch of statistical data. I can do a bunch of other things. Most other languages have something. And I would say that this is actually just like part of taking pride in your craft, is that like, can I make it so that doing an experiment's low cost enough that I don't have to put the startup at risk? But can I build a culture in which we can ask a question of the status quo and make it really easy to test the hypothesis? And I think this is where this book actually does a really good job, where yes, I completely agree. If the existential threat is, if we don't get enough customers by the end of the quarter, we're closing up shop.
Right.
Maybe doing all the optimization doesn't matter, is not a huge priority. But let's say you're blocked by waiting on a product manager or the CTO or CEO to get you feedback on something. And so you're like, instead of twiddling your thumbs for a couple hours, you're like, hey, I'm going to look at that benchmark thing. And it's really been bugging me. Like, I'm just going to kind of take some time that I had. And it does two things. Number one, it lets you decide, is this actually worth investigating? And then the number two is, it makes you go, you know what? We prioritize code quality. Maybe this one feature by itself doesn't matter, but you can imagine a cascading problem where I do one thing that's not idiomatic React, and then I build something on top of it that's not idiomatic React, and then I build something else on top of that that's not idiomatic React. And then a new person joins the team and they're like, why did we build it this way? Right? Like we're doing all this inefficient work and it looks like, and so I think this is one of those things where in your Terraform thing is a perfect example. These are those flywheels, right? Where if you categorically solve a problem, which is infrastructure is just part of the code base. right? That's what Terraform is at the end of the day.
Right.
Infrastructure is part of our change management. It's part of the code base. It should be boring. When I make an update to the infrastructure, it should just be a code review like anything else.
Right.
You know, when you do that, it changes the whole feeling of the company of like, oh, infrastructure is not this scary thing that I don't understand. I can go code review.
Right.
Adding a read replica to our database or, you know, whatever, right? Like whatever the thing, or yeah, we're, you know, Carter's obsessed with locking down permissions because our S3 buckets are, you know, too permissive to stuff. And I read this security article and I, you know, I don't want this. And so you can make a well-reasoned thing that says, hey, actually we only need, this is least privilege. And, you know, this is the permissions that we're going to have. To me, that's a culture, a maturity thing that it gives you confidence. And if you need to spin up a new environment, like an experimental environment, you literally change some environment variables, spin up a new workspace, and you're off to the races, right? You know with confidence that it's set up the same way. That's cool. You couldn't do that before when it was ClickOps or whatever, right? That's my, I mean, obviously I'm going to be kind of, I think I can get into the camp of premature optimization, like, and we all have our own thresholds of what that is. But if you hold yourself to a standard where you say, I can prove that this optimization actually will lead to, you know, 10x productivity, or it can reduce cognitive load. That's another thing that I don't think is premature. You know, I've seen this time and time again where like company implements Kubernetes, now expects every engineer to be a, you know, a Kubernetes YAML, you know, jockey, and they hate it. Like I've never seen an engineering team that was like, I love writing Kubernetes manifests so that I can get my app to run, right? So if you're going to introduce Kubernetes, it would behoove you to not make it as invisible as possible, right?
Right.
And Kubernetes can solve those problems. And I think the same thing is with React here, is that like, if once you see her output at the end of the chapter, you're like, oh, that's elegant. That's beautiful. It makes total sense. Like I read the code and I'm like, this is very understandable code. I didn't know how to get there before. Right?
Well, maybe we can talk then just about, like we said, domain specific books are challenging to discuss because we don't just want to be reading code to you guys, but maybe we just pull out one or two of the insights from this book that really stood out to us. Like, what do you got, Nathan?
So
what
I love
really
that
caught your attention?
Yeah, in the first 3 chapters, I'm kind of like scratching my head a little bit, and I'm like, why are we building stuff this way? There's these things called hooks, and I was like, why are we doing this? And then should we get to chapter 4, and it's like, oh, and by the way, 99% of these problems are solved with hooks.
Right.
And I was like, okay, that was actually my aha moment for how valuable this book was, because I needed the mental model of how React functions on a primitive level, and then why hooks. And we can get into, you know, what these hooks things are. But if you've used use state, use memo, use callback, any of those are hooks, right? Like that's that's what it is at the end of the day. You can also write your own custom hooks. You can write your own hooks that do cool state management. And because we built this foundation of like, how do components work? How does re-render work? All of a sudden in chapter 4, I'm like, this is why hooks are so amazing. And I don't think I had that aha moment before this book. So I think chapter 4 was like the big, yeah, this is worth my time investment. This is worth talking about on Book Overflow.
So what was it about chapter 4 specifically? Just because you talk about hooks. I mean, was it just realizing, because you knew how hooks work, right?
Yeah, I knew how hooks work. I was actually wondering why we were kind of like avoiding them in the first 3 chapters. I don't think it was until I realized that like hooks really categorically solved these sets of problems. And I didn't feel like I was wasting my time. I'm like, I wasn't like, oh, why did I learn all of these things in chapters 1 through 3? And now I'm throwing it out because hooks get us, like, it lets us sidestep all of this complexity. It was one of those things where I'm like, oh, how cool. We can sidestep all my cognitive load goes down because now I can use these well-designed hooks in React. This was, again, I wouldn't have appreciated if she had started on this of like, hey, hooks are awesome. And here's how a hook works. And like, if that was chapter 1, I don't think I would have had the deep appreciation until she went back and said, hey, you know, when we were talking about re-renders and how we were talking about moving props down to children, hooks let us do this clever thing. And, and so like, I don't know, it was one of those moments where like, I think I had like an 80% understanding of why these were great. And it was this advanced book gave me that like last 20% where I'm like, okay, very cool. And so, yeah, I think that was just, I don't know. It's definitely in the weeds. It's kind of hard to talk about on the podcast, but it's also just like the way that React does a lot of clever things. And there's a lot of clever ways that you can get tangled up because of it. But if you understand the clever things that React does, it's pretty cool. I guess that was my big takeaway by chapter 4.
Yeah, I'm trying to find, let me see if I can find the exact quote in the book. But yes, she talks about re-renders and because yes, like I'm just kind of continually impressed with her React knowledge. When she's talking about re-rendering, she says, you might have heard this statement: component re-renders when its props change. It's one of the most common misconceptions in React. Everyone believes it, no one doubts it, and it's just not true. Normal React behavior is that if a state update is triggered, React will re-render all the nested components regardless of their props. And if the state update is not triggered, then changing props will just be swallowed. React doesn't monitor them, which I thought was really, really interesting because like I kind of thought the same thing too. It's like, okay, yeah, you change the props, you that causes a re-render. But she's saying like it doesn't in two directions. One, if you update a prop, but that doesn't actually cause any part of the component to change, which like I don't know what that prop is doing, but hey, then that won't cause a re-render. But then similarly, you can do things that can cause re-renders that because you can do things that cause state update that don't have anything to do with prop changing, right?
Right.
And she has examples of that, but like we talked about, a little hard to talk about on the podcast.
But this is where that pass by reference stuff where you realize that like the underlying thing didn't change, but the reference to it did change, and so therefore you actually did change the prop, right? And there's like these kind of little like caveats and gotchas. Also, I didn't think about how children of a component is just the way that you write it in JSX is just syntactic sugar.
Yes,
I guess I kind of, yeah. Well, I kind of thought that, but
she's big on everything in React as a function. And so when you're creating a component, really you're just creating a function. And that function, all React component functions take a children prop. And then those are the children of your component. And so when in React or in JSX, you're doing, that thing where it looks like HTML, right? Where you have a component and then nested within it, you have other components, right? Like that's just syntactic sugar. And really those nested components, you're just passing them as the children prop to the, to your top level component.
Right.
And oh man, I was going to say something else, but yeah, I don't remember exactly.
So I do have one of a quote I underlined, and this is actually a recurring theme. It kind of drives me nuts, and it's also like this is the chaos you deal with JavaScript. But it's in chapter 4 under render props for rendering elements, and it says, luckily, as I mentioned before, there are a million ways to solve exactly the same problem in React. And of course, I hate this. I hate that there's a million ways to do it. Like, I will say that the things I like about Python and Go is that there's like one right way, like one considered idiomatic way of solving most problems.
Right.
You can do things in a very expressive and, kind of free-form way. But most of the time, there's sort of like the culture in those languages is like, hey, here's the idiomatic way of opening a file or caching something or, doing whatever, passing context, whatever. And JavaScript is kind of like culturally, it's kind of a madhouse. Like the frameworks change every week. You're running everything and like the JavaScript is such a mess of a language, and yet it's incredibly powerful. It's the only one that runs in the browser, right?
Right.
And you need it. And it's incredibly creative. Like the amount of creativity that comes out of the JavaScript community, I'm always in awe of. And yet it drives me nuts that there's a million ways to do anything, right?
Yeah. No, I've never been a JavaScript hater. I like JavaScript. I think, and I've tried to explain to people like who are kind of getting new to computer programming, because people kind of like They get mad that JavaScript is not very explicit. They get mad that like JavaScript will almost like soldier on in weird ways before it kind of finally gives up and says like, I don't know what you're asking me to do here, right? And
It
like
tries.
it tries, and that makes a lot of sense for something that runs in the browser, right? That
Mm-hmm.
makes a lot of sense for something that's very close to the user. It's like I'm going to give it my very best shot before I kind of throw my hands in the air and say like, I just don't know how to do this anymore, right? Which is different if you're writing like a backend server and you want it to be more explicit and say like, hey, you've, like a null pointer exceptions class example, like you're trying to call a function on something that's null, you can't do that, something has gone wrong here, error out, return a 500 to the user. And then really everyone's just kind of letting JavaScript do the dirty work at that point, right? Because you return the 500 to the user, and then JavaScript, the front end is in charge of figuring out how it's supposed to handle that. So yeah, I appreciate its flexibility as a language, but man, like I remember in school learning about it and just being shocked at like my first programming language was Java, which again is pretty explicit about it's very strongly typed, has null pointer exceptions, all of that, and you just come to JavaScript, which is like the Wild West. But I appreciate it. I'm not a JavaScript hater.
I'm glad it exists. It's a complete madhouse, but I think the internet itself is a complete madhouse. I have this in my hot takes, and I've said this in other episodes, but JavaScript is the language the internet deserves. Like I really, and I mean that both as a cutting criticism and as a compliment. I think if we had a more restrictive language, the internet wouldn't be the same. Like it just wouldn't. Right. So what about you? What's something in this book that stood out to you?
I loved chapter 6. Chapter 6 is called A Deep Dive into Diffing and Reconciliation. Something I was hoping to get out of this book. This book really gets into like really advanced React patterns and saying like, okay, so you'd want to do something like this. Here's an example of how you could do that. Here's all the ways you could go wrong. What I really would like to know more about, and I was hoping we get more of it in this book, and we get a decent amount in this chapter, is like, how is React working underneath the hood? Like, what is like the fundamental engine that is powering React? Like the event loop, for example. I know about the event loop. I don't know a ton of like how it's actually constructed or how
in the
running.
virtual DOM, and
exactly.
She touches on it a tiny bit of like, again, you're having this huge state machine that's described in the virtual DOM, and it's trying to like reconcile what's actually changing. And it's I'm cautiously optimistic because I like looked at the chapter titles for for chapter 9 through the end, and I'm like, well, I've not been let down so far. I'm like along for the ride,
Well, and so that's why I really like chapter 6, which again is called A Deep Dive into Diffing and Reconciliation. Lots of stuff in here, but it gets a little more into like, okay, so, we talk about re-renders, right? But how is React actually determining what gets re-rendered? What is going on underneath the hood? And she has this really great example where she talks about like, let's say you're filling out like a business form, like it's a tax business form. You're creating a tax business form, and you have a checkbox that basically says like, are you a company or not? If they're a company, you're going to want to have an input that you need the company tax ID. If you are a person, you're going to want an input that has like, maybe you want their social security number instead, right? And so you can imagine like having a component that's basically like, is company, you have a checkbox. So this is what your component looks like. There's a checkbox and then there's an input. And that input, depending on if is company is selected, and that's determined by the checkbox, is going to it's going to have like two different like placeholder text and ID, right? But it's the same input, right? Or maybe it's two different inputs. I mean, maybe that's the better example here. Like it's two. Well, okay, let's talk about them both ways. So one, it's the one input, and then you're changing the props on it, right? Like the placeholder and maybe the ID or something like that. Which says in the first example, when you click his checkbox and it goes to do the re-render, React is basically going to break your component into like an array, and it's going to be an array of what was like the state previously and the state as it currently is. And so the previous state array is going to say, okay, what do I have? I've got a checkbox, I've got an input. And it's just comparing those two types, just checkbox type and input type. What's your second one? It's going to say, well, I have a checkbox and an input, and it's going to say, these are the same thing. And so it's going to update the props, but it's not going to, if I got this right, it doesn't re-render the component, or does it? I don't know. How does this work?
And what's funny is that when I saw this, and like I felt like we were jumping through, and this is one area where I actually had a little bit. I've had this frustration before, and I was like, why aren't we just using keys? And then of course they finish up the chapter and they're like, oh, and by the way, keys are this like first class thing. And I was like, okay, so I felt good because I was like, okay, I actually understood this concept. I'm glad this is considered maybe an advanced concept, because that was a pleasant surprise that I was like, this is interesting, and like it's kind of juicy, and like, they had these ternary operators, which again, very JavaScripty, but I'm like, oh, it's so much compression of logic. But again, it's nice. And then, but how to do the reset and how to make state behave the way that you expect it to. It's a lot of this sort of like, it's almost like a little murder mystery, like a little mystery novel where you kind of have to figure out as you go. Chapter 6 was cool. I loved chapter 7. So chapter 7 is called Higher Order Components. And the reason I bring this one up is that anybody who's maybe, if you've used decorator patterns, right? And there's several languages that have solid decorator patterns. I'll say Python does, right? Where you use the @ symbol, and then maybe you want to have a LRU cache for a function. You can just like decorate it with this LRU cache from the LRU cache library. And what is really happening under the hood is that it's like a functor that's like, it takes a function. It's a higher order function that like takes your function as an argument and does some sort of state management stuff, and then passes your function back. And it's a little bit hard to wrap your head around at first. And again, she does such a great job of introducing someone to how a higher order components work. And again, this might be, I want to wrap idiomatic logging pattern on top of some component. And
so every time I click the button, we log something specifically.
And she even argues that like, hey, so this is how many of the routers behave. So if you use any of the routing libraries, that what it's really doing is these are higher order functions that kind of like wrap around your component logic and, maybe put some routing annotation stuff on top of it. I also loved, again, that it's like, hey, in most cases, you don't need this, and hooks have replaced this. And then gets into why this can actually cause surprising behavior, and it can be hard to reason about, but also it's considered kind of like legacy to a lot of folks. And I didn't know this about like the way that people think about these in React. At the same time, though, there's certain things that you can do with higher order components that are actually kind of hard to do with hooks. And like, for instance, like watching keyboard inputs, and she has some really good examples of where this actually could be pretty nice. And again, it's just the comfort level she has with the subject matter, the way that she introduces the topics. I finished this chapter up being like, I feel much more confident about making a decision on when to use a hook versus a higher order component. Or if I walk into it and I go, hey, we don't need this anymore, I think we should move to the hook because this is more maintainable or whatever, right? I liked that chapter.
You read this whole book, and it reminds me again of like, I think I've said this before, but when I got out of school and made my first resume, and you kind of list like all your skills, right? And I don't love a skills section on a resume, but that's for another discussion. But anyhow, and what I especially don't love on a resume is when you list like a skill and then you list like your level with the skill, because like, what does that mean? Because like, I think when I got out of school, I said like I was intermediate at Java, or I think I even said like advanced at Java. And now, having spent an additional, 8 years or so working in Java, I'd say I'm a beginner at Java. Like I barely know my way around it, right? And this is like React. It's like, I am obviously a much better React developer than I was when I first encountered it 6 years ago. And then you read this book, I'm like, I'm a little React baby. I don't know anything about this framework. Like, so if you really want to understand just how little you understand React, read this book. Or maybe you'll read it and be like, I knew all of that. And then you'll know that you truly know React.
There's that Oscar Wilde quote that's like, I'm not young enough to know everything. I think that's the...
I think I saw someone on Reddit, like his dad told him, he's like, well, you better move out now while you still know everything.
Right. Yeah. It's true though. Like there really is this sort of like, you have this ignorance. And I think that's actually also a virtue. when you have ignorance,
Right.
you think that anything's possible, and sometimes you're right about certain things. But then as you get more experience, you start becoming a little more cautious because you're like, yeah, actually, I don't know
Right.
anything.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, let's get to our hot takes. I kind of shared mine a little earlier, which is just like, how much of this do you really need to know? How much of us are really writing performance critical React? And like, obviously, you know, someone is maintaining Facebook, right? And like, that is probably performance critical React. I mean, someone is, Jira, I think is a great example, right? Where like, I'm thinking about like the drag and drop feature, like dragging, you know, take us different columns on Jira. It's like she said, like if you were to write something that even takes 3 milliseconds on every mouse mouse move event, that's going to completely kill your app. And I think people have high standards for how something like Jira should work because it's an expensive product. But I think most of us, when we're writing React, we're writing them for like, I don't know, like even when I was at like my the bigger tech companies I was at, like one of them, it was an internal it was internal tooling. So it wasn't super important for it to be very performance critical. And I think when you just look at like all the React developers in the world, just anyone who's working with React, a lot of those people are probably working for companies where it's not super important. A lot of those people, even if they're a lot of React apps are probably just like internal apps where it's not super important. It's probably a very, very small amount of people that are working on something this important. And that's not a slight at Nadia. She clearly wrote this book for advanced React developers, people who need to know this sort of stuff. I guess I just argue that there's probably not that many people who actually need to know all of this.
And I don't know. To me, it falls in that camp of like, part of it's the pride in the craft piece.
Right.
Part of it is that like, let's say you want to be a domain expert in React, or you really do run into this issue where you're running into performance critical pieces. And by performance critical though, I also mean that like, you know, if I was interviewing for a job and React was a big part of it, that hiring manager may have an advanced knowledge of React. And if you don't understand the basics of these components, you know, so I mean, that's one area. The other one is just like, I don't know. I like to know the right way of doing something. Like it bugs me if I'm just like, okay,
right.
Sure, I might do some kind of scrappy thing. The other thing is that I will say, you know, for the children is all this bad React code, it's going to get trained into the large language models, and the large language models are just going to teach us more bad React code. So like, I will say we should be careful. I would imagine, I haven't, you know, now that I have this in my mind, I wonder how much large language model output kind of violates a lot of these patterns. Yeah. And so I'm curious, maybe we're lucky, and maybe there's some kind of cool memory prompt that you can do to be like, create Nadia's like 10 takeaways and use that anytime I'm asking you questions about React. And I mean, you know, because then you might be able to have things like, you know, again, this is where I love with large language models is like, help me benchmark this implementation, and am I using React in an idiomatic way, right? Like those are the kind of questions that I'll, in planning mode with like Claude, I'll talk to you about, you know, do this implementation. I want to see if, you know, we're unnecessarily redrawing child components or whatever. And then, you know, then I don't have to spend 2 days writing benchmarks. I can let my throwaway code be the benchmark from the large language model. So I don't know. That's the kind of stuff where like it bugs me. Like if I see screen reflicker, I'm actually working on an app. Right. I mean, I'm working on a website right now that uses React, and I do a lot of server side rendering. And I noticed that like the font flashed for a second, and it bugged me. I didn't want that, right? And so I was just like, how do we fix this? And I found there's some really clever things you can do to make it so that like it doesn't do this redraw and some other stuff. And like, I was just proud. Like it didn't take me that long. It was like 15 minutes of effort, right? But I was like, yeah, this is, you know, and then like the performance benchmark on like these testing went from like 70% to 99%. And again, no one's going to leave my website because it loads, you know, 500 milliseconds slower, but they might.
Right.
But if it's super fast and renders really well, it at least leaves a positive impression of like, oh yeah, you know.
remember reading in the Plex, and Google's really big on that. That 100 milliseconds was a big deal to them. And we are aware, at work of the importance of writing good front end code. We've actually kind of waved the white flag, and we are hiring up until this point for engineers. We've just said, like, let's just hire anyone kind of competent, anyone who really impresses us. And we don't really care what their tech stack was. They can get used to ours. And we're doing a lot of Next.js, and we've kind of waved the white flag and said, like, we need someone who knows Next.js. So as much I want to advertise on the podcast, be like, hey, you want to work with me? Come work at my company, and we and use if you're really good at Next.js. And then it's one of the things, like, and we'll probably talk about this more in an episode later. Like, I've been just kind of observing, like, going from full remote to in office 5 days a week. And there are a lot of things I like about being in office 5 days a week. Again, a lot of that's cut down by the fact that my commute is 15 minutes on the bike. But man, recruiting, it's tough. Not only do we have to find someone who's an expert in Next.js that lives within a commutable distance of Lehi, Utah, but they also have to want to commute in Lehi, Utah, and they have to want to be in office 5 days a week. And It is not good. It makes it a lot harder. So if any of you are considering, the pros and cons of remote versus in person, know that collaboration has been improved in person, but man, recruiting is a beast. So that's a fun little aside in our React discussion. How about you, Nathan? Any hot takes?
Mostly it's not anything about the book itself other than, like, wow, React is complicated. It's complex. And the comfort level and threshold of, like, comfort that JavaScript developers have for all of this complexity is eye-opening. It's just funny that the book's like, yeah, well, this is kind of crazy, and I'm like, why is it so crazy, right? Like that's just the culture of the JavaScript community. They're just used to all this volatility, these changes in best practices, throwing out a bunch of stuff and doing a bunch of new patterns. The comfort level is super high. Other languages don't have that, right? You kind of are like, oh, well, this is the way that we render stuff, and here's our encoder and decoder tech, and you're not like, everything we thought about decoders is wrong, and now we're going to use this new library, and you're like, okay. But in JavaScript world, that's completely normal, and so it still takes me like a second to get used to this, where I'm like, man, the tolerance of this is so high, and the book feels that, right? And that's the thing. But yeah, that was my only big hot take. I love this book though, and honestly, I want to write some React. I'll put it that way.
Well, yeah, I think it's been a great book, and I think it's motivated a desire for change in our part. So we can talk about that. What are you going to change, Nathan? Because you've read the first half of this book.
So I know a ton about benchmarking code in Go. Mm-hmm. I know almost nothing about benchmarking code in JavaScript. And so this has inspired me to learn more about, like, what are the benchmarking frameworks and how do I visualize these things, and, like, what tools are available. And so, I have a little personal side project that I'm going to try to, benchmark and visualize some JavaScript code.
Yeah, I agree completely on benchmarking. I can't commit to, we're going to completely instrument the code with advanced benchmarking and really review this. But, like, I just don't even know the first thing about it in React. And so I would like to just figure out how you even do something like that. And even if I can only get benchmark reports one time, then when it comes time to, okay, we really need to have a sophisticated benchmarking process, I'm not starting from scratch. I felt that way with the Terraform stuff I've been writing this week, where, like, even though that our first experiment with Terraform didn't have a ton of lasting impact, I personally learned a lot about Terraform. And when I said, okay, it's time to actually get this instrumented in a more repeatable way, I wasn't also learning, like, the basics of Terraform when trying to do that. So I want to get into a similar place with benchmarking. And then, recommendations. Who would you recommend this book to, Nathan?
This book is squarely for what I'll call the intermediate React user. So you know enough to be dangerous. You find yourself getting tangled up in more advanced code bases, or maybe you've built the code base and you're tangled up yourself. This book, I think, is really a breath of fresh air. And for anyone who wants to kind of level up those skills, I think that's who I would recommend this to.
Yeah, I would say if you've been feeling personally like, I do a lot of work in React, but I don't I feel like I'm still just kind of a novice at it. Like, this book is obviously for you. I'd say anyone who's managing a performance critical React app, like if you're at a place that is already benchmarking your React app and it's a topic of discussion amongst the engineers, you should read this book and you should understand, okay, what patterns should I avoid? What patterns should I implement to make sure that we're hitting those benchmarks that we need to? And with that, I think that wraps it up for the first half of Advanced React by Nadia Makarevich. We will be back with the second half next week. And then, yeah, we're, like I said, hopefully a couple author interviews coming through the pipeline. Thanks for being patient with us as we went dark last week, a little unexpected, but it worked out well for both of our schedules. And we're excited we got a couple books for the remainder of the year, and then we'll do a couple special episodes. We like to pre-record those ahead of time so that Nathan and I can take all of December off, and then we're going to be back. I'm getting ahead of ourselves, but people have asked about it, so I want people to know. Designing data-intensive applications. It is on the schedule. We have pushed it to January because we want to be fresh and ready for it. So we're going to take all of December off. You won't notice because episodes will still be coming out weekly, but Nathan and I are going to be nice and fresh to tackle this in the brisk month of January. So get ready, folks. It's gonna be crazy. Anyhow, thanks for tuning in, everyone. You can always follow us on Twitter at Book Overflow Pod. I'm on Twitter at Carter Morgan. You can email us at contact@bookoverflow.io, and you can just go to bookoverflow.io to take a look at the schedule. And thanks for tuning in, folks. We'll see you around.